Ooh, there we go. I didn't even touch it, and it still went on. Okay, well, we're on book six of Plato's Republic. This is primarily about the education of philosopher kings and Plato's um, very crude test that he has to see whether or not a philosopher king actually has the proper motivation or not. He specifically points out that the only crude test we can really have is to test whether or not someone is actually a philosopher king or not, is to see if they are a lover of money or not. So an example would be like if they are very much have that kind of mindset where they are chasing after luxury, chasing after money, then we can say that they don't actually have the proper motivation. That they are too that um, they're too corrupted by the world. Not corrupted. Perhaps that's not the right word, but something along that lines where like they're corrupted by the virtues of the world or the because remember, like chasing after money is not actually a thing in of itself, but it's a way to amass power and to acquire things for oneself. And so, if you're too busy chasing after your own personal interests, then your interests are not actually wholly for the city itself. And I mean, this is the exact critique that Jagmeet Singh, of the leader of the NDP in Canada, is facing right now in politics, where we have seen him over and over again. He's the leader of the Socialist Party, whereby he's supposed to be an advocate that all for one and one for all. We are not supposed to care about winning unless we are all winning together. And yet we see him time and time again pursue things like luxury brands, drive away in expensive cars, and really care about that personal image, which is just entirely in conflict with the views that he's supposed to be upholding. And I mean, we could see his poll numbers drop in kind of in accordance with that, because people are kind of fed up of having hypocritical leaders in power where they're not actually living out the virtues that they claim to have. And so, I mean, Versace bags and Louis Vuitton is just not an acceptable thing to purchase when you're a socialist leader. But further and above that, we know that there's all these studies that have been completed about like, hey, what is the actual level of wealth and um, possessions that is sustainable for society to have in this kind of in this climate crisis environment. What is the sustainable amount of possessions? What is the sustainable amount of sustainable lifestyle we can have in order to not go over our climate emissions? And if we could all revert to that lifestyle, what would then work for everyone? And we find that it's the one car family, the family that can live within their means, perhaps only has one car. I mean, of course, like if you need more for work, then that's obviously something that could be worked out, right? And especially when we get more environmentally friendly vehicles, we could perhaps add more luxuries to this. But they often say it's like that 1970s lifestyle where it's like you have that one car family, one person goes out to work, the other one takes care of the home, and perhaps you even have a small garden in the back and try to grow some of your own vegetables and have trees and really just be stewards of the environment around you so much as you're able to. But that 1970s lifestyle just isn't realistic in today's economy. And so, I mean, so even further than just being a socialist who just doesn't uphold socialist values in their own personal life, he's not even upholding modern environmental views, but environmental standards that we would be expecting of our leaders who want to push for a better world. And so he's a hypocrite on both fronts in that kind of respect. Um, and I'm sure we can critique all the leaders in different ways. That's just an example of how like a philosopher king, someone who claims to represent the highest moral virtues and claim that they are deserving to run a country. We even have these critiques from 2,000 years ago that can just be very clearly applied to leaders in our own day and age. Um, and I mean, the Conservative Party perhaps doesn't even subscribe to these types of values, but so it's like um, all the more apparent when we apply them to people like Jagmeet Singh, who has been in power for quite some time now. So power, I mean, like leader of his party for quite some time. But alas, here we go. On to book 6 of the Republic, and let's see how long we got here. So, um, yeah, I did pre-read this one, so hopefully this a couple times actually. I read it twice through, so hopefully this we can get through this quite quickly. It's 29 pages, so here we go. And so, Glaucon, I said, through a somewhat lengthy argument, who the philosophers are and who the non-philosophers has, with considerable effort, somehow been brought to light. Perhaps, he said, that's because it could not have easily been done through a short one. It doesn't look like it, I said. Still, in my opinion at least, it would have been better done if this were the only question that had to be treated, and there weren't many things left to treat for one who has gotten to see the difference between the just life and the unjust one. What's after this for us, he said. What else but what's next, I said, since philosophers are those who are able to grasp what is always the same in all respects, while those who are not able to do so, but wander among what is many and varies in all ways are not philosophers, which should be the leaders of a city. How shall we put it so as to speak sensibly, he said. Those who look as if they're capable of guarding the laws and practices of cities should be established as guardians. Right, he said. But it is plain, I said, whether it's a blind guardian or a sharp-sighted one who ought to keep watch over anything. Of course it's plain, he said. Well, does there seem to be any difference, then, between blind men and those men who are really deprived of the knowledge of what each thing is, those who have no clear pattern in the soul, and are hence unable, after looking off, as painters do, towards what is truest, and ever referring to it, and contemplating it as precisely as possible, to give laws about what is fine, just, and good, if any need to be given, and as guardians to preserve those those that are already established. No, by Zeus, he said, there isn't much difference. Shall we set these men up as guardians, rather than those who not only know what each thing is, but also don't lack experience, or fall short of the others in any part of virtue? It would be strange to choose others, he said, if, that is, these men don't lack the rest. For the very thing in which they would have the advantage is just about the most important. Then shouldn't we say how the same men will be able to possess these two distinct sets of qualities? Most certainly. Well then, as we were saying at the beginning of this argument, first their nature must be thoroughly understood, and, I suppose, if we should come to an adequate agreement about that, we'll also agree that the same men will be able to possess both, and that there should be no other leaders of the cities than these. How shall we do it? About philosophic natures, let's agree that they are always in love with that learning which discloses to them something of the being that is always and does not wander about, driven by generation and decay. Yes, let's agree to that. And further, I said, that just like the lovers of honor and the erotic men we described before, they love all of it and don't willingly let any part go, whether smaller or bigger, more honorable or more compatible. More contemptible. What you say is right, he said. Well, next consider whether it is necessary in addition that those who are going to be such, as we were saying, have this further characteristic in their nature. What? No taste for falsehood. That is, they are completely unwilling to admit what's false, but hate it, while cherishing the truth. It's likely, he said. It's not only likely, my friend, but also entirely necessary, that a man who is by nature erotically disposed towards someone care for everything related and akin to his boy. Right, he said. Now, could you find anything more akin to wisdom than truth? Of course not, he said. Now, is it possible that the same nature be both a lover of wisdom and a lover of falsehood? In no way. Therefore, the man who is really a lover of learning must from youth on strive as intensely as possible for every kind of truth. Entirely so. But further, we surely know that when someone's desire inclines strongly to some one thing, they are therefore weaker with respect to the rest, like a stream that has been channeled off in that other direction. Of course. So when in someone they have flowed towards learning and all that's like it, I suppose they would be concerned with the pleasure of the soul itself with respect to itself, and would forsake those pleasures that come through the body if he isn't a counterfeit but a true philosopher. That is most necessary. Such a man is, further, moderate, and in no way a lover of money. Money and the great expense that accompanies it are pursued for the sake of things that any other man, rather than this one, is likely to take seriously. That's so. And you too must, of course, also consider something else when you're going to judge whether a nature is philosophic or not. What? You mustn't let its partaking in illiberality get by you mustn't let its partaking in illiberality get by you unnoticed. For petty speech is of course most opposite to a soul that is always going to reach out for the whole and for everything divine and human. Very true, he said. To an understanding endowed with magnificence and the contemplation of all time and all being, do you think it possible that human life seem anything great? That human life seem anything great? Impossible, he said. Won't such a man also believe that death is not something terrible? Not in the least. So a cowardly and illiberal nature would not, as it seems, participate in true philosophy. Not in my opinion. What then? Is there any way in which the orderly man, who isn't a lover of money, or illiberal, or a boaster, or a coward, could become a hard bargainer or unjust? There isn't. And further, when you are considering whether a soul is philosophic or not, you'll also take into consideration whether, from youth on, it is both just and tame or hard to be a partner with and savage. Most certainly. And you won't leave this out either, I suppose. What? Whether he learns well or with difficulty, or do you ever expect anyone would care sufficiently for a thing that, when he does it, he does painfully, accomplishes little with much effort? That could not be. And what if he were able to preserve nothing of what he learns, being full of forgetfulness? Would it be possible he be not empty of knowledge? Of course not. So toiling without profit, don't you suppose he'll finally be compelled to hate both himself and in an activity of this sort? Of course. Let us never, then, admit a forgetful soul into the ranks of those that are adequately philosophic. In our search, let us rather demand a soul with a memory. Most certainly. Further, we would deny that what has an unmusical and graceless nature is drawn in any direction other than that of want of measure. Of course. Do you believe that truth is related to want of measure or to measure? To measure. Then beside the other things, let us seek for an understanding endowed by nature with measure and charm, one whose nature grows by itself in such a way as to make it easily led to the idea of each thing that is. Of course. What then? Have we, in your opinion, gone through particular qualities that are in any way unnecessary and inconsequent to one another in a soul that is going to partake adequately and perfectly in what is? They are, he said, most certainly necessary. Certainly most necessary. Is there any way, then, in which you could blame a practice like this that a man could never adequately pursue if he were not by nature a rememberer, a good learner, magnificent, charming, and a friend and kinsman of truth, justice, courage, and moderation? Not even Momus, he said, could blame a practice like that. When such men, I said, are perfected by education and age, wouldn't you turn the city over to them alone? And Adeimantus said, Socrates, no one could contradict you in this. But here is how those who hear what you now say are affected on each occasion. They believe that because of inexperience at questioning and answering, they are at each question misled a little by the argument. And when the littles are collected at the end of the arguments, the slip turns out to be great and contrary to the first assertions. And just as those who aren't clever at picking plain draughts are finally checked by those who are, and don't know where to move, so they too are finally checked by this other kind of draughts, play not with counters but speeches, and don't know what to say. However, the truth isn't in any way affected by this. In saying this, I look to the present case. Now someone might say that in speech he can't contradict you at each particular thing asked, but indeed he sees that of all those who start out on philosophy, not those who take it up for the sake of getting educated when they are young and they then drop it, but those who linger in it for a longer time. Most become quite queer, not to say completely vicious, while the ones who seem perfectly decent do nevertheless suffer at least one consequence of the practice you are praising. They become useless to the cities. And when I heard this, I said, "Do you suppose that the men who say this are lying?" "I don't know," he said, "but I should gladly hear your opinion. You would hear that it looks to me as if they were speaking the truth." "Then how," he said, "can it be good to say that the cities will have no rest from evils before the philosophers, whom we agree to be useless to the cities, rule in them?" Whom we agree to be useless to the cities, rule in them. "The question you are asking," I said, "needs an answer given through an image. And you in particular," he said, "I suppose, aren't used to speaking through images." "All right," I said. "Are you making fun of me after having involved me in an argument so hard to prove? At all events, listen to the image so you may see still more how greedy I am for images. So hard is the condition suffered by most decent men with respect to the cities, that there is no single other condition like it. But I must make my image an apology on their behalf by bringing it together from many sources, as the painters paint goats, stags, and such things by making mixtures. Conceive something of this kind happening either on many ships or one. Through though the ship though the ship owner surpasses everyone on board in height and strength, he is rather deaf and likewise somewhat short-sighted, and his knowledge of seamanship is pretty much on the same level. The sailors are quarreling with one another about the piloting, each supposing he ought to pilot, although he has never learned the art and can't produce his teacher or prove that there was a time when he was learning it. Besides this, they claim it isn't even teachable, and are ready to cut to pieces the men who say it is teachable. And they are always crowded around the shipowner himself, begging and doing everything so that he'll turn the rudder over to them. And sometimes, if they fail at persuasion and other men succeed at it, they'll either kill the others or throw them out of the ship, enchaining the noble shipowner with mandrake, drink, or something else. They rule the ship, using what's in it and drinking and feasting. They sail as such men would be thought likely to sail. Besides this, they praise and call skilled sailor, pilot, and knower of the ship's business the man who is clever at figuring out how they will get the rule, either by persuading or by forcing the shipowner, while the man who is not part of this sort they blame as useless. They don't know that for the true pilot it is necessary to pay careful attention to year, seasons, heaven, stars, wind, and everything that's proper to the art, if he is really going to be skilled at ruling a ship. And they don't suppose it's possible to acquire the art and practice of how one can get hold of the helm whether the others wish it or not, and at the same time to acquire the pilot's skill. So with such things happening on the ships, don't you believe that the true pilot will really be called a stargazer, a praetor, Prater, and useless to them by those who sail on ships run like this? Indeed he will, said Adeimantus. Now, I said, I don't suppose you need to scrutinize the image to see that it resembles the cities in their disposition towards the true philosophers, but you understand what I mean. Indeed I do, he said. First of all, then, teach the image to that man who wonders at the philosophers not being honored in the cities, and try to persuade him that it would be far more to be wondered at if they were honored. I shall teach him, he said. And further, that you are telling the truth in saying that the most decent of those in philosophy are useless to the many. However, bid him blame their uselessness on those who don't use them, and not on the decent man. For it's not natural that a pilot begs sailors to be ruled by him, nor that the wise go to the doors of the rich. The man who has invented that subtly lied. The truth naturally is that it is necessary for a man who is sick, whether rich or poor, to go to the doors of the doctor, and every man who needs to be ruled to the doors of the man who is able to rule, not for the ruler who is truly of any use to beg the ruled to be ruled. You'll make no mistake in imagining the statesmen now ruling to be the sailors we were just now speaking of, and those who are said by them to be useless and gossipers about what's above to be the true pilots. Quite right, he said. Well then, on this basis and under these conditions, it's not easy for the best pursuit to enjoy a good reputation with those who practice the opposite. But by far the greatest and most powerful slander comes to philosophy from those who claim to practice such things, those about whom you say philosophy's accuser asserts that most of those who go to it are completely vicious and the most decent useless. And I admitted that what you say is true. Isn't it so? Yes. Haven't we gone through the cause of the uselessness of the decent ones? Yes, indeed. Do you want us next to go through the necessity of the viciousness of the many, and to try to show, if we were able, that philosophy isn't to blame for that? Most certainly. Then let us bring our listening and speaking by reminding ourselves of the point at which we started our description of the kind of nature with which the man who is to be a gentleman is necessarily endowed. First, if it's present in your mind, truth guide him, and he had to pursue it entirely and in every way, or else be a boaster who in no way partakes of true philosophy. Yes, that was said. Now isn't this one point quite contrary to the opinions currently held about him? Very much so, he said. So then, won't we make a sensible apology in saying that it is the nature of the real lover of learning to strive for what is, and he does not tarry by each of the many things opined to be, but goes forward and does not lose the keenness of his passionate love, nor cease from it before he grasps the nature of each thing which is, with the part of the soul fit to grasp the thing of that sort. And it is the part akin to it that it fit. And once near it, and coupled with what really is, having begotten intelligence and truth, he knows and lives truly, is nourished, and so ceases from his labor pains, but not before. Nothing, he said, could be more sensible. What then? Will this man have any part in caring for falsehood, or, all to the contrary, will he hate it? He'll hate it, he said. If truth led the way, we wouldn't, I suppose, ever assert a course of evils could follow it. Of course not. But a healthy and just disposition, which is also accompanied by moderation. Right, he said. Why then must I also force the rest of the philosophic nature's course into order all over again from the beginning? You surely remember that, appropriate to these, courage, magnificence, facility at learning, and memory went along with them. And you objected, saying that everyone would be forced to agree to what we were saying. But if they let the arguments go and look to the man themselves whom the arguments concern, they would say they see that some of them are useless, and the many bad, possessing vice entire. In considering the cause of the slander, we've now come to this point. Why are the many bad? And it's for just this reason that we brought up the nature of the true philosophers again, and defined what it necessarily is. That's so, he said. Then we must, I said, look at the corruptions of this nature, and see how it is destroyed in many, while a small number escape, just those whom they call not vicious, but useless. And after that, in turn, we must look at the natures of the souls that imitate the philosophic nature, and set themselves up in its practice, and see what sort they are who approach a practice that is of no value for them, and beyond them, and who often strike false notes, thereby attaching to philosophy everywhere, and among all men, a reputation such as you say. What corruptions do you mean? He said. I shall try, I said, if I am able, to go through them for you. Now I suppose everybody will agree with us about this. Such a nature, possessing everything we prescribed just now for the man who is going to become a perfect philosopher. Such natures are few and born only rarely among human beings, or don't you suppose so? Indeed I do. Now consider how many great sources of ruin there are for those few. Just what are they? What is most surprising of all to hear is that each one of the elements we praise in that nature has a part in destroying the soul that has them and tearing it away from philosophy. I mean courage, moderation, and everything we went through. Yes, he said, that is strange to hear. And what's more, I said, Besides these, all the things said to be goods corrupt it and tear it away: beauty, wealth, strength of body, relatives who are powerful in a city, and everything akin to these. You see the type of thing I mean. I do, he said, and I would gladly learn more precisely what you mean. Well then, I said, grasp it correctly as a whole, and it will look perfectly plain to you, and what was said about them before won't seem strange. What do you bid me do? What do you bid me do? He said. Concerning every seed or everything that grows, whether from the earth or animals, I said, we know that the more vigorous it is, the more it is deficient in its own properties when it doesn't get the food. When it doesn't get the food, climate, or a place suitable to it. For surely bad is more opposed to good than to not good. Of course. So I suppose it is reasonable that the best nature comes off worse than an ordinary one from an inappropriate rearing. Yes, it is. Won't we say for souls too, Adeimantus? I said, that similarly, those with the best natures become exceptionally bad when they get bad instruction? Or do you suppose an ordinary nature is the source of great injustices and unmixed villainy? Don't you suppose, rather, that it's a lusty one corrupted by its rearing, while a weak nature will never be the cause of great things, either good or bad? Yes, he said, that's the case. Well then, I suppose that if the nature we set down for the philosopher chances on a suitable course of learning, it will necessarily grow and come to every kind of virtue. But if it isn't sown, planted, and nourished in what's suitable, it will come to all the opposite, unless one of the gods chances to assist it. Or do you too believe, as do the many, that certain young men are corrupted by sophists, and that there are certain sophists who, in a private capacity, corrupt, to an extent worth mentioning? Isn't it rather the very men who say this are the biggest sophists, who educate most perfectly, and who turn out young and old, men and women, just the way they want them to be? But when do they do that? He said. When, I said, many gathered together, sit down in assemblies, courts, theaters, army camps, or any other common meeting of a multitude, and, with a great deal of uproar, blame some of the things said or done, and praise others, both in excess, shouting and clapping, and besides, the rocks and the very place surrounding them echo and redouble the uproar of blame and praise. Now, in such circumstances, as the saying goes, what do you suppose is the state of the young man's heart? Or, what kind of private education will hold out for him and not be swept away by such blame and praise, and go, borne by the flood, wherever it tends, so that he'll say the same things are noble and base as they do, practice what they practice, and be such as they are? The necessity is great, Socrates, he said. And yet, I said, we still haven't mentioned the greatest necessity. What? He said. What these educators and sophists inflict indeed when they fail to persuade in speech. Or don't you know that they punish the man who's not persuaded with dishonor, fines, and death? Yes, he said, they punish very severely. So what other sophists, or what sort of private speeches do you suppose will go counter to these and prevail? I don't suppose any will, he said. No, I said, but even the attempt is a great folly. For a character receiving an education contrary to theirs does not, has not, and will not become differently disposed towards virtue. A human character, that is, my comrade, for the divine, according to the proverb. Let's make an exemption to the argument. You should be well aware that if anything should be saved and become such as it ought to be regimes in this kind of condition, it won't be bad if you say that a God's dispensation saved it. I am of no other opinion, he said. Well then, I said, besides the one, be of this opinion too. What? That each of the private wage earners whom these men call sophists and believe to be their rivals in art educates in nothing other than these convictions: of the many, in these convictions of the many, which they opine when they are gathered together, and he calls this wisdom. It is just like that the case of the man who learns by heart of angers, by the heart the angers and the desires of the great, strong. Okay, let's try that sentence again. Starting this paragraph again with so this is Socrates talking. That each of the private wage earners whom these men call sophists and believe to be their rivals in art educates in nothing other than these convictions of the many, when they opine when they are gathered together, and he calls this wisdom. It is just like the case of a man who learns by heart the angers and desires of the great, strong beast he is rearing, how it should be approached and how taken hold of, when, as a result of what, it becomes most difficult or most gentle, and particularly under what conditions it is accustomed to utter its several sounds, and, in turn, what sorts of sounds uttered by another make it tame and angry. When it has learned all this from associating and spending time with the beast, he calls it wisdom, and organizing it as an art, turns to teaching. Knowing nothing in truth about which of these convictions and desires is noble, or base, or good, or evil, or just, or unjust, he applies all these names following the great animal's opinions, calling what delights it good, and what vexes it bad. He has no other argument about them, but calls the necessity just and noble, neither having seen nor being able to show someone else how much the nature of the necessary and the good really differ. Now, in your opinion, wouldn't such a man, in the name of Zeus, be out of place as an educator? Yes, he said. In my opinion, he would indeed. So does this man seem any different from the man who believes it is wisdom to have figured out the anger and pleasures, whether in painting, music, or particularly in politics, of the multifarious many who assemble? However a man associates with them, whether he makes a display of poetry or any other product of craft, or any service to the city, making the many his masters beyond what is necessary, the so-called necessity of Diomed will compel him to produce the things that these men praise, but that those things are in truth good and noble. Have you up to now ever heard anyone presenting an argument for this that isn't ridiculous? No, he said, nor do I suppose I shall hear one. Well then, keep all this in mind and recall the question. Can a multitude accept or believe that the fair itself, rather than the many fair things, or that anything itself, is, rather than the many particular things? Not in the least, he said. Then it's impossible, I said, that a multitude be philosophic. Yes, it is impossible. And so, those who do philosophize are necessarily blamed by them. Necessarily. As well as by all those private men who consort with the mob and desire to please it. Plainly. So, on this basis, what salvation do you see for this philosophic nature? So on what basis, what salvation do you see for a philosophic nature, so that it will remain in its practice and reach its ends? Think it over on the basis of what went before. We did agree that facility at learning, memory, courage, and magnificence belong to this nature. Yes. Won't such a one be first among all in everything, straight from the beginning, especially if his body naturally matches his soul? Of course he will, he said. Then I suppose kinsmen and fellow citizens will surely want to make use of him, when he is older, for their own affairs. Of course. They will, therefore, lie at his feet begging and honoring him, taking possession of, and flattering beforehand the power that is going to be his. At least, he said, that's what usually happens. Do you suppose, I said, such a man will do in such circumstances, especially if he chances to be from a big city, is rich and noble in it, and is, further, good-looking and tall? Won't he be overflowing with unbounded hope, believing he will be content to mind the business of both Greeks and barbarians? And won't he, as a result, exalt himself to the heights, mindlessly full of pretension and empty conceit? Indeed he will, he said. Yeah, this is an interesting point. Um, the the Greeks very much um, praise those who were not only good speakers and um, uh, were able to convince people, like the sophists, in public, but they were also very much believers in appearances as well. That you had to be tall, good looking, and charming, and um, yeah, and it was very much an appearance based. Like they were even so afraid of looking weaker then that they didn't even want to have a cut on them because if they drew blood in public, it could damage their reputation and they could lose an election. And so they had to have they cared about appearances so much that it was almost like quite frankly it was to their detriment. But it just reminds me of like the leadership lessons they would teach in air cadets. I did air cadets from, gosh, I think I was like 13 to till I aged out at 19. And I went to a number of different summer camps, including basic introduction to leadership. I ended up getting my glider license, and then the final summer I was in it, um, which was the summer before I joined the military. I was a basic, I was a cadet instructor. Um, Not a cadet instructor. I was a cadet who was supervising other cadets at the basic band camp at, Bla- at the Blackdown base in Barrie, just outside of Barrie, Ontario. Anyways, but like one of the key things they talk about in leadership was not, and this really struck me when I was like 13 years old and hearing this for the first time, that they consistently we often look to people who are tall, good looking, charming as the people who should naturally lead. And right from that young age, they started impressing upon us how it's not about those things, it's about integrity, honesty, and like a virtue centric approach to leadership. And that really always struck me. But in practice, I don't really see it as something that actually is manifested in the world. People still very much look to those who are tall, charming, and handsome as the as leaders of society, regardless of how equipped they are. I mean, and there is certainly some truth to it. Like we have like leaders need to be able to persuade and they need to be able to bring people on board and a certain level of charm is necessary for that and being able to talk persuasively like just thinking like war times like we always have to be ready to lead a country into war time scenarios and so a philosopher king and perhaps this is one of the counterpoints um, to a more virtue centric approach is that like we need to be able to convince the masses to follow our lead so that if our country is threatened by war or by invasion by another country then we do need to be able to give the rousing speeches we need to be the Winston Churchills of our time and garner the support of a country to be able to get the war machine up and running and to uh, uphold a strong resistance. And so perhaps there is more to it than perhaps I would like to admit, but I mean, certainly, gosh, like perhaps the best example of this, like who's certainly not really charming or overly good looking, but like Charlie Angus from Timmins, the MP from who's in the NDP party. Oh gosh, I couldn't say enough kind things about him. He has just been such a steadfast person within Parliament, who's been not only representing, um, been an elected representative for a long time, but it has just been a voice of integrity and that virtue centric approach. If I was to say anyone is deserving of being prime minister, it would be him more than anyone. Not because of, like particularly of his values, because I probably would stem closer to the Liberal Party than NDP, just because you need a strong economy in order to have socialist values, and if we were going to have a true socialist party in Canada, you would need to mimic those um, Scandinavian countries that have just a strong sovereign wealth fund that funds their socialist endeavors. And until we see some intelligent policies come out of the NDP to support some of those notions, and where we just have this excess amount of capital, you can't really pursue socialism in the same kind of way. And until we can get our economy going and revitalize, we need a bit of a balancing act to not only protect those from falling into that desperate form of poverty that is just so crippling and debilitating and depressing. Because I mean, if there isn't jobs for people to go to, people can't work, and that is fundamentally what we are seeing with those under the age of 30. I talked about that CD Howe poll, happiness poll from in a previous episode, but those over the age of 60, with those with all the money in the world, uh, they're perfectly happy in Canada. Those under the age of 30 are absolutely miserable, and their happiness is tanked so much so that we would be ranked 58th in the world if we were just comparing the happiness of those under 30. And so we we need to be a forward-leaning society. We need those jobs in place. We to vote for a socialist party when we don't have the funds to be able to properly fund it is inherently problematic. At the same time, like, you can go too far. Like, if you're just going to cut everything, like, I mean, I guess that's a conversation for another thing, and we're talking about leadership here. But the idea that yeah, but like in that virtue centric idea of leadership, it's so important to be first and foremost to have that integrity to stand up for what's right and to continually say the right things and to continually push for um, what's right. And yeah, I guess Charlie Angus would be the best example I could point to in our modern day politics. But anyways, alas, let's carry on here. Now, if someone were gently to approach the young man in this condition and tell him the truth that he has no intelligence in him, although he needs it, and that it's not to be acquired except by slaving for its acquisition, do you think it will be easy for him to hear through a wall of so many evils? Far from it, he said. Being a slaving for its acquisition of intelligence. Yeah, I would say that that's the case. Reading is certain. I mean, it's certainly a lost art in today's society, but um, becoming. I mean, I'd like to think that I have some level of intelligence, and it is certainly not easy to acquire. It is a rigorous pursuit, and that's all I'll say about that. Far from it, he said. But if, I said, thanks to his good nature and his kingship to such speeches, one young man were to apprehend something and be turned and drawn toward philosophy, what do we suppose those will do who believe they are losing his use and comradeship? Is there any deed they won't do or any word they won't say concerning him, so that he won't be persuaded, and concerning the man who's doing the persuading, so that he won't be able to persuade? And won't they organize private plots and public trials? It's very necessary, he said. Is it possible that such a young man will philosophize? Not at all. Do you see, I said? It wasn't bad when we said that the very elements of the philosophic nature, when they get a bad rearing, are, after all, in a way the cause of its being exiled from the practice, and so are the so-called goods, wealth, and all equipment of the sort. No, it wasn't, he said. And what was said is right. Then, you surprising man, I said, such is the extent and character of this destruction and corruption of the best nature with respect to the best pursuit. And such a nature is a rare occurrence in any event, we say. And particularly from these men come those who do the greatest harm to cities and private men, as well as those who do the good. If they chance to be drawn in this direction, no little nature ever does anything great, either to private man or city. Very true, he said. So these men, for whom philosophy is most suitable, go thus into exile and leave their abandoned and unconsummated. They themselves live a life that isn't suitable or true, while, after them, other unworthy men come to her, like an orphan bereft of relatives, and disgrace her. These are the ones who attach to her reproaches such as even you say are alleged by the men who reproach her, namely, that of those who have intercourse with her, some are worthless, and the many worthy of many bad things. Yes, he said, that is what is said. And what is said is fitting, I said. For other mannequins see that this place has become empty, although full of fine names and pretensions. And, just like those who run away from prisons to temples, these men too are overjoyed to leap out of the arts into philosophy, those who happen to be the subtlest in their little art. For although philosophy is faring thus, it still retains a more magnificent station in comparison with the other arts at least. Aiming at this, many men with imperfect natures, just as their bodies are mutilated by the arts and crafts, so too their souls are doubled up and spoiled as a result of being in mechanical occupations, or isn't that necessary? Quite so, he said. Do you suppose, I said, that there are any different to see than a little bald-headed worker in bronze who has gotten some silver and, newly released from bonds, just washed in a bathhouse, wearing a new-made cloak and got up like a bridegroom, is about to marry his master's daughter because he's poor and destitute? Hardly at all different, he said. What sort of things are such men likely to beget? Aren't they bastard and ordinary? Quite necessary. And what about this? When men unworthy of education come near her and keep her company in an unworthy way, what sort of notions and opinions will we say they beget? Won't they be truly fit to be called sophisms, connected with nothing genuine or worthy of true prudence? That's entirely certain, he said. Then it's a very small group, Adeimantus, I said, which remains to keep company with philosophy in a way that's worthy, perhaps either a noble or well-reared disposition, held in check by example, remains by her side consistent with nature, for want of corruptors, or when a great soul grows up in a little city, despises the business of the city, and looks out beyond, and perhaps a very few men from another art who justly despise it because they have good natures, might come to her, and the bridle of our comrade Thegus might be such as to restrain him, for in Thegus's case all other conditions for an exile from philosophy were present, but the sickliness of the body, shutting him out of politics, restrains him. My case, the demonic sign, isn't worth mentioning, for it is perhaps occurred in some one other man, or no other, before. Now the men who have become members of this small band have tasted how sweet and blessed a possession it is. At the same time, they have seen sufficiently the madness of the many, and that no one who minds the business of the cities does virtually anything sound, and that there is no ally with whom one could go to the aid of justice and be preserved. Rather, just like a human being who has fallen in with wild beasts and is neither willing to join them in doing injustice, nor sufficient as one man to resist all the savage animals, one would perish before he has been of any use to the city or friends, and be of no profit to himself or others. Taking all this into the calculation, he keeps quiet and minds his own business, as a man in a storm, when dust and rain are blown about by the wind, stands aside under a little wall. Seeing others filled full of lawlessness, he is content if somehow he himself can live his life here pure of injustice and unholy deeds, and take his leave from it graciously and cheerfully with fair hope. Well, he said, he would leave having accomplished not the least of things, but not the greatest either, I said, if he didn't chance upon a suitable regime, for in a suitable one he himself will grow more and save the common things along with the private. Now the reasons why philosophy is slandered, and that it isn't just that to be, and the reasons why philosophy is slandered, and that it isn't just that it be, have in my opinion been sensibly stated, unless you still have something else to say. I have nothing further to say about this, he said. But which of the current regimes do you say is suitable for it? None at all, I said. But this is the very charge I'm bringing. Not one city today is in a condition worthy of the philosophic nature, and this is why it is twisted and changed. Just as a foreign seed sown in alien ground is likely to be overcome and fade away into the native shock, so too, this class does not at present maintain its own power, but falls away into alien disposition. But if it ever takes hold in the best regime, just as it is itself best, then it will make plain that it really is divine as we agreed it is, and that the rest are human, both in terms of their natures and their practices. Of course, it's plain that next you'll ask what this regime is. You've not got it, he said. That's not what I was going to ask, but whether it is the same one we described in founding the city or another. It is the same in other respects, I said, and in this very one too, which we stressed in connection with it, that there would always have to be present in the city something possessing the same understanding of the regime as you, the lawgiver, had when you were setting down the laws. Yes, he said, that point was made. But it wasn't made sufficiently plain, I said, from fear of what you people, with your insistence, have made plain, that its demonstration would be long and hard, and now what's left is by no means the easiest to go through. What is it? How a city can take philosophy in hand without being destroyed, for surely all great things carry with them the risk of a fall, and, really as the saying goes, fine things are hard. All the same, he said, let the proof get its completion by clearing this up. It won't be hindered by a lack of willingness, but, if by anything, by a lack of capacity, I said. You'll be on hand to see my eagerness at least. Consider how eagerly and recklessly I am going to say now that the way a city takes up this practice should be in the opposite of what it has done nowadays. How? Nowadays, I said. Those who take it up at all are lads fresh from childhood. In the interval before running a house and making money, they approach its hardest part and then leave those, that is, who are fancied to be complete philosophers. I mean by the hardest part that which has to do with speeches. In later life, if others are doing this, and they are invited, they believe it's a great thing if they are willing to be listeners, thinking it ought to be done as a hobby, toward an old age. Except, of course, for a certain few, they are far more extinguished than Heracles' son, inasmuch as they are not rekindled again. How ought it to be, he said. Entirely opposite. When they are youths and boys, they ought to take up the education and philosophy suitable for use. They take very good care of their bodies at the time when they are growing and blooming into manhood, thus securing a helper for philosophy. And as they advance in age to the time when the soul begins to reach maturity, it ought to be subjected to a more intense gymnastic. And when strength begins to fail and they are beyond political and military duties, at this time they ought to let loose to graze and do nothing else, except as a spare time occupation. Those who are going to live happily, and, when they die, crown the life they had lived with a suitable lot in that other place. In my opinion, you truly are speaking eagerly, Socrates, he said. However, I suppose that the many among the hearers are even more eager to oppose you, and won't be persuaded at all, beginning with Thrasymachus. Don't make a quarrel between Thrasymachus and me when we've just become friends. Though we weren't even enemies before, I said. We'll not give up our efforts before we either persuade him and the others, or give them some help in preparation for that other life when, born again, they meet with such arguments. That's a short time you are speaking about, he said. No time at all, I said, if you compare it to the whole. However, it's no wonder that the many are not persuaded by these speeches, for they never saw any existing thing that matches the present speech. Far rather, they have seen such phrases purposely balanced with one another, not falling together spontaneously as they are now. But as for a man who, to the limit of the possible, is perfectly likened to and balanced with virtue in deed and speech, and holds power in a city fit for him, they have never seen one or more, or do you suppose so? Not at all. Nor, you blessed man, have they given an adequate hearing to fair and free speeches of the sort that strain with every nerve in quest of the truth for the sake of knowing, and that nod a distant greeting to the subtleties and contentious quibbles, and contentious quibbles that strain toward nothing but opinion and convention in trials as well as in private groups? No, they haven't, he said. Well, it was on account of this, I said, foreseeing it then, that we were frightened, but at the same time compelled by truth. We said that neither city nor regime will ever become perfect, nor yet will a man become perfect in the same way either, before some necessity chances to constrain those few philosophers who aren't vicious. Those are now called useless, to take charge of a city, whether they want to or not, and the city to obey, or a true erotic passion for true philosophy flows from some divine inspiration into the sons of those who hold power, or the office of king, or into the fathers themselves. I deny that there is any reason why either or both of these things is impossible. If that were the case, we would justly be laughed at for uselessly saying things that are like prayers, or isn't that so? Yes, it is. Therefore, if in the endless time this paragraph is underlined for note. Therefore, if in the endless time that has gone by, there has been some necessity for those who are on the peaks of philosophy to take charge of a city, or there even now is such a necessity in some barbaric place, somewhere far outside of our range of vision, or will be later, in this case, we are ready to do battle for the argument that the regime spoken of has been, is, and will be when this muse has become master of a city. For it's not impossible that it has come to pass, nor are we speaking of impossibilities, that it's hard, we two agree. That, he said, in my opinion is so. Will you, I said, say that in the opinion of the many it isn't so? Perhaps, he said. You blessed man, I said, don't make such a severe accusation against the many. They will no doubt have another sort of opinion. If instead of indulging yourself in quarreling with them, you soothe them and do away with the slander against the love of learning by pointing out whom you mean by the philosophers, and by distinguishing, as was just done, their nature and character of their practice, so that many won't believe you, mean those whom you suppose to be philosophers. And if they see it this way, doubtless you'll say that they will take on another sort of opinion and answer differently. Or do you suppose anyone of an ungrudging and gentle character is harsh with a man who is not harsh, or bears grudges against a man who bears none? I shall anticipate you and say that I believe that so hard a nature is in a few, but not the multitude. I too, he said, of course share your supposition. Don't you also share my supposition that the blame for the many's being harshly disposed towards philosophy is on those men from outside who don't belong and have burst in like drunken revelers, abusing one another and indulging a taste for quarreling, or who always make their arguments about persons, doing what is least seemly in philosophy? Very much so, he said. For presumably, Adeimantus, a man who has his understanding truly turned toward the things that are, has no leisure to look down towards the affair of human beings, and to be filled with envy, and ill will as a result of fighting with them, but rather because he sees and contemplates things that are set in regular arrangement and are always in the same condition, things that neither do injustice to one another nor suffer it at another's hands, but remain all in according to reason. He imitates them and, as much as possible, makes himself like them. Or do you suppose there is any way of keeping someone from imitating that which he admires and therefore keeps company with? It's not possible, he said. Then it's the philosophers, keeping company with the divine and the orderly, who becomes orderly and divine, to the extent that it's possible for any human being. But there is much slander abroad. In every way, that's most certain. If some necessity arises, I said, for him to practice putting what he sees there into the dispositions of men, both in private and in public, instead of forming only himself, do you suppose he'll prove to be a bad craftsman of moderation, justice, and vulgar virtue as a whole? Least of all, he said. Now if the many become aware that what we are saying about this is true, they then be harsh with the philosophers and distrust us when we say that a city could never be happy otherwise than by having its outlines drawn by painters who use the divine pattern? No, they won't be harsh, he said, provided they do gain this awareness. But what kind of drawing do you mean? They would take the city and the dispositions of human beings as though they were a tablet, I said, which in the first place they would wipe clean, and that's hardly easy. At all events, you know that straight off in this they would differ from the rest, in not being willing to take either private man or city in hand, or to draw laws before they receive it clean or themselves make it so. And they are right, he said. Next, don't you think they would outline the shape of the regime? Of course. After that, I suppose that in filling out their work, they would look away frequently in both directions towards the just, fair, and moderate by nature and everything of the sort, and again toward what is in human beings, and thus, mixing and blending the practices as ingredients, they would produce the image of man, taking hints from exactly that phenomena in human beings which Homer too called godlike and the image of God. Right, he said. And I suppose they would rub out one thing and draw another again, until they made human dispositions as dear to the gods as they admit of being. The drawing, he said, would at any rate be fairest that way. Are we then somehow persuading those men who you said were coming at us full speed? I said, that the man we were then praising to them is such a painter of regimes? It was on his account that they were so harsh, because we were handing the cities over to him. Are they any gentler on hearing it now? Yes, and very much so, he said, if they are moderate. For how will they be able to dispute it? Will they say the philosophers aren't lovers of what is aren't lovers of that which is and of truth? That would be strange, he said. Or that their nature is, as we described it, isn't akin to the best? Not that either. Nor this, that such a nature, when it chances on suitable practices, will not be perfectly good and philosophic, if any is, or are those men whom we excluded by nature more so now? More so. Surely not. Will they still be angry when we say that before the philosophic class becomes master of a city, there will be no rest from ills either for city or citizens, nor will the regime about which we tell tales in speech get its completion indeed? Perhaps less, he said. If you please, I said. Let's not say that they are less angry, but that they have become in every way gentle and have been persuaded, so that from shame, if nothing else, they will agree. Most certainly, he said. Now let's assume they have been persuaded of this, I said. And as to the next point, will anyone argue that there is no chance that children of kings or of men who hold power could be born philosophers by their nature? There won't, he said, even be one who will argue that. And if such men came into being, can anyone say that it's quite necessary that they be corrupted? That it's hard to save them, we too admit. But that in all of time, not one of all of them could ever be saved. Is there anyone who would argue that? How could he? How could he? But surely, I said, the birth of one, if he has an obedient city, is sufficient for perfecting everything that is now doubted. Yes, he said, one is sufficient. For of course, when a ruler sets down the laws and practices that we have gone through, I said, it's surely not impossible that the citizens will be willing to carry them out. Not at all. But then, is it anything wonderful or impossible if others also have done the same opinions as we do? I suppose so, he said. And further, that it is best. Granted it's possible, we have, I believe, already gone through sufficiently. Yes, it was sufficient. Now then, as it seems, it turns out for us that what we are saying about law-giving is best if we could come to be, and that it is hard for it to come to be not, however, impossible. Yes, he said, that's the way it turns out. Now that this discussion has, after considerable effort, reached an end, mustn't we next speak about what remains? In what way and as a result of what studies and practices the saviors will take their place within our regime for us, and at what ages each will take up each study. Indeed, we must, he said. It hasn't, I said, turned out to have been very wise of me to have left aside previously the unpleasantness about the possession of women, nor to have left aside procreation, as well as the institution of the rulers either. I did so because I knew that the holy and completely true institution is a thing both likely to arouse resentment and hard to bring into being. But, as it was, the necessity of going through these things nonetheless arose. Well, what particularly concerns women and children has been completed, but what concerns the rulers must be pursued, as it were, from the beginning. We were saying, if you remember, that they must show themselves to be lovers of the city, tested in pleasures and pains, and that they must show that they don't cast out conviction in labors or fears or in any other reserve. The man who's unable to be so must be rejected, while the one who emerges altogether pure, like gold tested in fire, must be set up as the ruler, and be given gifts and prizes both when he is alive and after he has died. These were the kinds of things that were being said as the argument, covering his face, sneaked by, for fear of setting in motion what now confronts us. What you say is quite true, he said. I do remember. My friend, I shrank from saying what has now been dared anyhow, I said. And let's now dare to say this. Philosophers must be established as the most precise guardians. Yes, let it be said, he said. Then bear in mind that you'll probably have but a few, for the parts of the nature that we described as a necessary condition for them are rarely willing to grow together in the same place. Rather, its many parts grow forcibly separated from each other. How do you mean, he said. You know that natures that are good at learning have memories, are shrewd and quick and everything else that goes along with these qualities, and are as well full of youthful fires and magnificence. Such natures don't willingly grow together with understandings that choose orderly lives which are quiet and steady. Rather, these men who possess them are carried away by their quickness, which wherever chance leads, and all steadiness goes out from them. What you say is true. And on the other hand, those steady, not easily changeable disposition, which one would be inclined to court on as trustworthy, and which in war are hard to move in the face of fears, act in the same way in the face of studies. They are hard to move and hard to teach, as if they have become numb, and they are filled with sleep and yawning when they must work through anything of the sort. That's so, he said. But we are saying that this nature must participate in both in good and fair fashion, or it mustn't be given a share in the most precise education, in honor or in rule. Right, he said. Don't you suppose this will be rare? Of course. Then it must be tested in the labors, fears, and pleasures we mentioned then, and moreover, what we passed over then we mention now. It must also be given gymnastic in many studies to see whether it will be able to bear the greatest studies, or whether it will turn out to be a coward, as some turn out to be cowards in other things. Well, that's surely the proper way to investigate it, he said. But exactly what kinds of studies do you mean by the greatest? You, of course, remember, I said, that by separating out 3 forms in the soul, we figured out what justice, moderation, courage, and wisdom each is. If I didn't remember, he said, it would be just for me not to hear the rest. And also, what was said before that? What was it? We were, I believe, saying that in order to get the finest possible look at these things, another and longer road around would be required, and to the man who took it would become evident. But the proofs on a level with what has been said up to then, could be tacked on, and you all said that would suffice. And so, you see, the statements made at a time were, as it looks to me, deficient in precision. If they were satisfactory to you, only you can tell. They were satisfactory to me within measure, he said, and it looks as though they were for others too. My friend, I said, a measure in such things which in any way fall short of that which is no measure at all. For nothing incomplete in the measuring of anything. But certainly men are sometimes of the opinion that this question has already been adequately disposed of, and there and that there is no need to seek further. Easygoingness, he said, causes quite a throng of men to have this experience. Well, I said, it's an experience a guardian of a city and the laws hardly needs. That's likely, he said. Well then, my comrade, such a man must go to the longer way around and labor no less at study than at gymnastic, or else, as we were just saying, he'll never come to the end of the greatest and most fitting study. So these aren't the greatest, he said, but there is something yet greater than justice and the other things we went through? There is something greater, I said. And also even for these very virtues, it won't do to look at a sketch, as we did a little while ago, but at their most perfect elaboration must not be stinted. Or isn't it ridiculous to make every effort so that other things of little worth be as precise and pure as can be, while not deeming the greatest things worth the greatest precision? That's a very worthy thought, he said. However, as to what do you mean by the greatest study, and what it concerns, do you think anyone is going to let you go without asking what it is? Certainly not, I said. Just ask. At all events, it's not a few times already that you have heard it, but now you are either not thinking or have it in mind to get hold of me again and cause me trouble. I suppose it's rather the latter, since you have many times heard that the idea of the good is the greatest study, and that it's by availing oneself of it, along with just things and the rest, that they become useful and beneficial. And now you know pretty certainly that I'm going to say this, and besides this, that we don't have sufficient knowledge of it. And if we don't know it, and should have ever so much knowledge, the rest without this, you know that it's no profit to us, just as there would be none in possessing something in the absence of the good. Or do you suppose it's of any advantage to possess everything except what's good, or to be prudent about everything else in the absence of the good, while being prudent about nothing fine and good? So this is the point where, for the first time, Plato, through Socrates, is introducing the ideas of the forms of the good. And so, he's going to get to this in later chapters. He doesn't fully explain it in here, but above justice, above these baseline virtues that the philosopher king must have, he is putting the idea, this utopic idea of the good, above all else. And so this is his idea of the forms. It's this idealistic notion that we need to be in pursuit of the good, and even though we may not be able to so clearly state it in any other way, it's just this ambiguous notion that rests above, that we are trying to pursue. I'm probably not doing a very good job at explaining it, but that rests above these virtues. Baseline virtues must work towards it, like justice, prudence, moderation, and the internal virtues of like having good memory, being good at education. We must continually work towards the good, and even though this is the real difference between Aristotle and Plato, is that Plato is really we're trying to idealistically pursue something that isn't quite tangible, and so where Aristotle is much more factual, and so we'll see, we'll make the comparisons as we get there. But what was the other point I was going to make? Stand by. I've lost it now. Okay, well, that was the end. So, no, by Zeus, he said, I don't. Okay, back to Socrates. And further, you also know that in the opinion of the many, the good is pleasure, while in that of the more refined it is prudence. Of course. And my friend, that those who believe that this can't point out what kind of prudence it is, but are finally compelled to say about the good. And it's quite ridiculous of them, he said. Of course it is, I said, if they reproach us for not knowing the good, and then speak as though we did know, for they say it's prudence about the good, as though we, in turn, grasped grasp what they mean when they utter the name of the good. Very true, he said. And what about those who define pleasure as good? Are they any less full of confusion than the others who aren't too compelled to agree that there are bad pleasures? Indeed they are. Then I suppose the result is that they agree that the same things are good and bad, isn't it? Of course. Isn't it clear that there are many great disputes about it? Of course. And what about this? Isn't it clear that many men would choose to do, possess, and enjoy the reputation for things that are opined to be just and fair, even if they aren't? Well, when it comes to good things, no one is satisfied with what is opined to be so, but each seeks the things that are. And from here on out, everyone despises the opinion. Quite so, he said. Now this is what every soul pursues, and for the sake of which it does everything. The soul divines that it is something, but is at a loss about it, and unable to get a sufficient grasp of just what it is, or to have a stable trust such as it has about the rest. And because this is so, the soul loses any profit there might have been in the rest. Will we say that even those best men in the city, into whose hands we put everything, must be thus in the dark about a thing of this kind and importance? Least of all, he said. I suppose at least, I said, that just and fair things, when it isn't known and in what way are good, who have gotten themselves a guardian whose worth very much in the man who doesn't know this. I divine that no one will adequately know the just and fair things themselves before this is known. That's a fine divination of yours, he said. Won't our regime be perfectly ordered if such a guardian, one who knows these things, oversees it? Necessarily, he said. But now, Socrates, do you say that the good is knowledge, or pleasure, or something else besides these? Here's a real man, I said. It's been pretty transparent all along that other people's opinions about these things wouldn't be enough for you. It doesn't appear just to me, Socrates, he said, to be ready to tell other people's convictions, but not your own, when you have spent so much time occupied with these things. And what about this, I said? Isn't it your opinion that it's just to speak about what one doesn't know as though one knew? Not at all as though one knew, he said. However, one ought to be willing to state what one supposes as one supposition. What? I said. Haven't you noticed that all opinions without knowledge are ugly? The best of them are blind. Or do men who opine something true without intelligence seem to you any different from blind men who travel the right road? No, he said. Do you want to see ugly things, blind and crooked, when it's possible to hear bright and fair ones from others? No, in the name of Zeus, Socrates, said Glaucon. You're not going to withdraw when you are, as it were, at the end. It will satisfy us even if you go through the good just as you went through justice, moderation, and the rest. It will quite satisfy me too, my comrade, I said, but I fear I'll not be up to it, and in my eagerness I'll cut a graceless figure and have to pay the penalty by suffering ridicule. But you, blessed men, let's leave aside for some time what the good itself is, for it looks to me as though it's out of the range of our present thrusts to attain the opinions I now hold about it. But I'm willing to tell what looks like a child of the good and most similar to it, if you please, or if not, to let it go. Do tell, he said. Another time you'll pay us what's due on the father's narrative. I wish I could, I said, that I were able to pay and you were able to receive it itself, and not just the interest, as is the case now. Anyhow, receive this interest and child of the good itself, but be careful that I don't in some way unwillingly deceive you in rendering the account of the interest fraudulent. We'll be as careful as we possibly can, he said. Just speak. Yes, I said. As soon as I've come to an agreement and reminded you of the things stated here earlier and already often repeated on other occasions. What are they? He said. We both assert that they are, I said, and distinguished in speech many fair things, many good things, and so on for each kind of thing. Yes, so we did. So we do. And we also assert that there is a fair itself, a good itself, and so on for all things that we then set down as many. Now, again, we refer to one idea of each as though the idea were one, and we address it as that which really is. That's so. And moreover, we say that we say that the former are seen but not intellected, while the ideas are intellected but not seen. That's entirely certain. With what part of ourselves do we see the things seen? With the sight, he said. Isn't it with hearing, I said, that we hear the things heard, and with the other senses that we sense all that is sensed? Of course. Have you, I said, reflected on how lavish the craftsman of the senses was in the fabrication of the power of seeing and being seen? Not very much, he said. Well, consider it this way. Is there a need for another class of thing in addition to hearing and sound, in order that the one hear and the other be heard, a third thing in the absence of which the one won't hear and the one won't be heard? No, I suppose. No, he said. I suppose, I said, that there are not many other things, not to say none, that need anything of the kind. Or can you tell of any? Not I, he said. Don't you notice that the power of seeing and what's seen do have such a need? How? Surely when sight is in the eyes, and the man possessing them tries to make use of it, and color is presented in what is to be seen, in the absence of a third class of thing whose nature is specifically directed to this very purpose, you know that the sight will see nothing, and the colors will be unseen. Okay, 5 pages. What class of thing are you speaking of, he said. It's that which you call light, I said. What you say is true, he said. Then the sense of sight and the power of being seen are yoked together with a yoke that, by the measure of an idea, by no means insignificant, is more honorable than the yokes uniting other teams, if light is not without honor. But of course, he said, it's far from being without honor. Which of the gods in heaven can you point to as the Lord responsible for this, whose light makes our sight see in the finest way, and the seen things seen? The very one you and the others would also point to, he said. For it's plain your question refers to the sun. Its sight, then, naturally related to this God in the following way. How? Neither sight itself, nor that in which it comes to be, what we call the eye, is the sun. Surely not. But I suppose it is the most sun-like of the organs of the senses. Yes, by far. Doesn't it get the power it has as a sort of overflowing from the sun's treasury? Most certainly. And the sun isn't slight either. It is, but as its cause is seen by sight itself. That's so, he said. Well then, I said, say that the sun is the offspring of the good. I mean, an offspring of the good beget in a proportion with itself, as the good is the intelligible region with respect to intelligence and what is intellected. So the sun is in the visible region with respect to sight and what is seen. How, he said. Explain it to me still further. You know, I said, that eyes, when one no longer turns them to those things over whose colors the light of day extends, but to those over which the gleams of night extended, are dimmed and appear nearly blind, as though pure sight were not in them. Quite so, he said. But I suppose, when one turns them on those things illuminated by the sun, they see clearly, and sight shows itself to be in the same eyes. Surely. Well then, think that the soul is also characterized in this way. When it fixes itself on that which is illuminated by truth, and that which is, it intellects, knows, and appears to possess intelligence. But when it fixes itself on that which is mixed with darkness, on coming into being and passing away, it opines and is dimmed, changing opinions up and down, and seems at such times not to possess intelligence. Yes, that's the way it seems. Therefore, say that what provides the truth to the things known and gives power to the one who knows is the idea of the good, and as the cause of knowledge and truth, you can understand it to be a thing known, but as fair as these two are knowledgeable and truth, if you believe that it is something different from them and still fairer than they, your belief will be right. As for knowledge and truth, just as in the other region, it is right to hold light and sight sun-like, but to believe them to be sun is not right. So too here, to hold these two to be like the good is right, but to believe that either of them is the good is not right. The condition which characterizes the good must receive still greater honor. You speak of an overwhelming beauty, he said. If it provides knowledge and truth, but is itself beyond them, beyond them in beauty, you surely don't mean it is pleasure. Hush, Glaucon, I said, but consider its image still further in this way. How? I suppose you'll say that the sun not only provides what is seen with the power of being seen, but also with generation, growth, and nourishment, although it itself isn't generation. Of course. Therefore, say that not only being known is present in the things known as a consequence of the good, but also existence and being are in them besides as a result of it. Although the good isn't being, but is still beyond being, exceeding it in dignity and power. And Glaucon quite ridiculously said, Apollo, what a demonic excess! You, I said, are responsible for compelling me to tell my opinions about it. And don't under any condition stop, he said, at least until you have gone through the likeness with the sun, if you are leaving anything out. But of course, I said, I am leaving out a throng of things. Well, he said, don't leave even the slightest thing aside. I suppose I will leave out quite a bit, I said, but at the same, insofar as much is present, I'll not leave anything out willingly. Don't, he said. Well then, I said, conceive that, as we say, these two things are, and that the one is king of the intelligible class and region, while the other is king of the visible. I don't say of the heaven, so as not to seem to you to be playing the sophist with the name. Now, do you have these two forms, visible and intelligible? I do. Then take a line cut in two unequal segments, one for the class that is seen, and the other for the class that is intellected, and go on and cut each segment in the same ratio. Now, in terms of relative clarity and obscurity, you'll have one segment in the visible part for images, I mean by images for shadows, then appearances produced in water, and in all close-grained, smooth, bright things, and everything of the sort, if you understand. I do understand. Then in the other segment, put that of which this first is the likeness, the animals around us, and everything that grows, and the whole class of artifacts. I put them there, he said. And would you also be willing, I said, to say that with respect to truth, or lack of it, as the opinable and distinguished from the knowable, so the likeness is distinguished from that of which it is the likeness? I would indeed, he said. Now, in its turn, consider also how the intelligible section should be cut. How? Like this, in one part of it a soul, using as images the things that were previously imitated, is compelled to investigate on the basis of hypotheses, and makes its way not to a beginning but to an end, while in the other part it makes its way to a beginning, that it is free from hypotheses, starting out from a hypothesis, and without the images used in the other part, by means of forms themselves, it makes in its inquiry through them. I don't, he said, sufficiently understand what you mean here. So he just introduced the idea of the forms. Let's try again, I said. You'll understand more easily after this introduction. I suppose you know that the men who work in geometry, I suppose you know that the men who work in geometry, calculation, and the like treat as known the odd and the even, the figures, 3 forms of angles, and other things akin to these in each kind of inquiry. These things they make hypotheses, and don't think it worthwhile to give any further account of them to themselves or others, as though they were clear to all. Beginning from them, they go ahead with their exposition of what remains, and end consistently at the object towards which their investigation was directed. Most certainly I know that, he said. don't you also know that they use visible forms besides and make their arguments about them, not thinking about them, but about those others that are alike? They make the arguments for the sake of the square itself and for the diagonal itself, and not for the sake of the diagonal they drew, and likeness with the rest. These things themselves that they mold and draw, of which they are shadows and images in water, they now use as images, seeking to see those things themselves, that one can see in no other way than with thought. What you say is true, he said. Well then, this is the form I said was intelligible. However, a soul in investigating it is compelled to use hypotheses, and does not go to a beginning because it is unable to step out above a hypothesis and it uses as images those very things of which images are made by the things below, and in comparison with which they are opined to be clear and are given honor. I understand, he said, that you mean what falls under geometry and its kindred arts. Well then, go on to understand that by the other segment of the intelligible, I mean that which argument itself grasped with the power of dialectic, making the hypotheses not beginnings, but really hypotheses, that is, stepping stones and springboards, in order to reach what is free from hypothesis at the beginning of the whole. When it has grasped this, argument now depends on that which depends on this beginning, and in such fashion goes back down again to an end, making no use of anything sensed in any way, but using forms themselves, going through forms to forms, it ends in forms too. I understand, he said, although not adequately, for in my opinion it's an enormous task you speak of, that you wish to distinguish that part of what is and is intelligible contemplated by the knowledge of a dialectic as being clearer than that part contemplated by what are called the arts. The beginnings in the arts are hypotheses, and although those who behold their objects are compelled to do so with the thought and not the senses, these men, because they don't consider them by going up to a beginning, but rather on the basis of hypotheses, these men, in my opinion, don't possess intelligence with respect to the objects, even though they are, given a beginning, intelligible. And you seem to me to call the habit of geometers and their likes thought and not intelligence, indicating that thought is somewhere between opinion and intelligence. You have made a most adequate exposition, I said, and along with me, take these four affections arising in the soul in relation to the four segments, intellection in relation to the highest one, and thought in relation to the second, and to the third assign trust, and to the last imagination. Imagine them in a proportion, and believe that as the segments to which they correspond participate in truth, so they participate in clarity. I understand, he said, and I agree and arrange them as you say. And that's the end of the book. I just want to do that last part again. Take these four afflictions arising in the soul in relation to the four segments, intellection in relation to the highest one, and thought in relation to the second, in the third assign trust, and in the last imagination, and arrange them in proportion, and believe that as the segments to which they correspond participate in truth, so they participate in clarity. And there you go. That is the end of book 6, and we about an hour and a half. That's not bad. We're a little bit quicker than we've been with the other chapters, and we'll be moving on to book 7 pretty soon here. I'm looking forward to when they're talking to. I haven't read book 7 yet, but I will before we read it tomorrow. I'm looking forward to when we can actually talk about education. I don't know if we're going to be talking about the cave, but I did really like the ship analogy. That I mean, it's interesting. He notes that the philosopher kings are not the ones who seek out power themselves, but that they should be the ones recognized and be given that power by the ship owner. Like, as using that analogy of the ship owner should be the one seeking out the one with the perfect knowledge of how to run the ship, instead of the people who seek out the power for themselves, trying to undercut and undermine each other. And this happens in especially in Canadian politics all the flipping time, where the opposition party is just trying to play these parlor tricks to try to gain power and to overthrow the current regime when they're up in the polls. Um, the the governing Liberal Party, which has for so long been the natural, they call themselves the natural leaders of the country, the natural governors of the country. They they use every trick in the books to try to keep themselves in power, um, switching between leaders without a general election in between, and will often try to go from liberal leader to liberal leader without interruption. Um, and certainly, like, there's some necessity to that in Canadian politics, especially if um, you truly believe that what you're doing is right and best for the community as a whole. But perhaps there should be more checks on that power, and we should be pursuing more of a separation of powers. It's often kind of said about Canadian politics that the prime minister is just a democratic dictator because there is so much power coalesced in that one person that there isn't really adequate ways to hold them to account. You can even see, like, when Parliament is prorogued, that there isn't the House of Commons to hold them accountable. The Governor General is essentially a muse for them to use, and the courts are too far removed for them to actively participate in the day-to-day politics, and the Senate hasn't really been useful for quite some time. I mean, they certainly review and add their critiques to bills, but they never actively oppose the will of the government, especially once their inclinations are set into the throne speech itself. And so we don't have a sufficient government in place with checks on power that is sufficient for a modern democracy. And so I think we definitely have room for improvement here in Canada as well. So, anyways, that's the end of book 6. Um, and on to book 7 tomorrow or the day after. Pip pip cheerio.